A heavily pregnant woman arrives at the ER, doubled over in pain, only to face cruelty and indifference. What begins as a desperate struggle for care escalates into a confrontation that exposes systemic injustice. One act of courage sets off a chain of events that will shake an entire city. The fluorescent lights of Metropolitan General Hospital's emergency room hummed overhead, casting sharp shadows across cracked linoleum floors. At 3 a.m., the waiting room was a mixture of exhaustion and quiet suffering. In the corner, Sarah Williams sat hunched over, her hand pressed firmly against her swollen belly, sweat glistening along her dark skin. At 8 months pregnant, every contraction and cramp felt like a warning, a cruel reminder of the fragility of life she carried within her. She clutched her phone, glancing at the time, wondering if her husband was still buried in city council work, oblivious to the storm unfolding at the ER. Behind the reception desk, Patricia Hendris sat with deliberate poise, her eyes scanning a magazine as if the world outside her carefully controlled bubble didn't exist. She was 45, with sharp blonde hair pulled into a tight bun, uniforms always crisp, shoes polished, and an attitude honed over 20 years of navigating the hospital's corridors with quiet authority. Patricia had learned the art of finding power in small cruelties, the ability to make someone wait, the skill to dismiss complaints with a flick of her wrist, and the comfort of knowing she could rule her little kingdom behind the front desk. Tonight, like every night, she was untouchable. Sarah's voice cracked as she approached, trembling. "Please, I have insurance, my baby. I need help." Her words were almost drowned by the fluorescent buzz and the distant coughs and moans of other patients. Patricia finally looked up, her blue eyes cold as winter ice, scanning Sarah with thinly veiled contempt. "Don't lie to me," she snapped. Her words were not a question, but a verdict. Sarah stepped closer, instinctively shielding her belly. "I just need someone to check on my baby. I think something's wrong." Patricia's thin lips curled into a smirk. "Keep your distance. Don't you dare raise your voice in my ER." And then, with a vicious slap that echoed through the waiting room, Sarah's head snapped to the side, her hand flying to her stinging cheek. The mark burned like fire, but worse was the humiliation, the complete dismissal of her pain. The waiting room fell silent. Security cameras captured every detail, but Patricia remained unaware, fully convinced of her absolute authority. Around them, the other patients shifted uncomfortably, murmuring under their breaths, sensing the injustice but trapped by their own fears. Dr. Jennifer Carter, a young resident in emergency medicine, watched from the entrance to the treatment area. She noticed the pattern immediately. A patient in obvious distress, denied care because of the gatekeeper's personal prejudice. She knew the risks of challenging a head nurse, evaluations, references, and her fledgling career, but her instincts screamed that something was terribly wrong. Carlos Mendez, the night shift janitor, swept near the desk, pretending to mop while keeping a watchful eye. 8 years of nightly work had made him a silent witness to countless injustices, the quiet cruelties inflicted on patients and staff alike. He knew Patricia's reputation, her contempt for anyone she deemed beneath her small but relentless abuses of power. He gripped the mop handle tighter, knowing he couldn't act yet, trapped by policy but not by conscience. Security guard Mike Foster patrolled the halls with weary vigilance. A retired officer of 23 years, he recognized tension before it erupted. He saw Patricia leaning forward, her posture predatory, and Sarah trembling under the weight of fear and pain. He knew the night shift allowed for unchecked authority, for people like Patricia to believe they were untouchable. Sarah's breathing grew shallow as another contraction ripped through her abdomen, sharp and unrelenting. She pulled her cardigan tighter, wishing she could disappear. Her mind flashed to the simple life she led with her husband James, the second-grade classroom filled with eager students, the food bank where she volunteered, the Sunday choir that gave her solace. None of that mattered here. Her dignity, her life, her unborn child were dismissed like a trivial inconvenience. 3 hours, Patricia said sharply, finally looking up, her voice slicing through the hum of the fluorescent lights. 3 hours you've been waiting. Some people wait all night. Maybe if you had better insurance, you'd get faster service. I do have insurance, Sarah said, her voice trembling. Blue Cross, my husband's job. He's a city worker. We're not on welfare. Patricia's sneer deepened. Sanitation, road crew, union job. You people think pregnancy gives you special rights. You think the world owes you something? She circled the desk like a predator, enjoying the fear she cultivated. Sarah clutched her belly as another wave of pain crashed over her. Please, just check on my baby. That's all I need. Her words carried desperation, courage, and clarity. Basic human decency should have been enough, yet it was met with contempt. A young mother in the corner discreetly recorded the interaction on her phone. Carlos's eyes narrowed. He knew the rules, but something about tonight felt different. Patricia's control was absolute until now, but even she could not predict how quickly the seeds of accountability were taking root. As Sarah doubled over, the room seemed to shrink around her suffering, her vulnerability highlighted against Patricia's towering presence. The head nurse's authority had long gone unchecked, but tonight it was clear. Power without accountability could not last forever, and in that moment, under the harsh fluorescent lights of Metropolitan General Hospital, the first tremors of change began to ripple through the emergency room, unnoticed by Patricia but felt by everyone who bore witness. Sarah Williams, vulnerable and 8 months pregnant, had unknowingly stepped into a confrontation that would expose the cruelty and corruption lurking behind the sterile walls of the night shift. The fluorescent lights of Metropolitan General Hospital glared down on Sarah Williams as another contraction tore through her abdomen, sharp and unrelenting. Sweat dripped down her temples and her hands clutched the edge of the reception desk, leaving faint indentations in the laminate surface. Her breathing was ragged, shallow, and urgent, a rhythm dictated by the mounting pain she could no longer endure. A small fleck of blood appeared on her maternity dress, catching the light as she instinctively pressed a hand to her stomach, panic rising. Something was seriously wrong, and every second of delay could be critical for her baby. Patricia Hendress observed her with the same cold detachment she always carried like armor. She leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, her eyes narrowing with an almost predatory satisfaction. "You're overreacting," she said sharply, her words slicing through the tension in the waiting room. "Pregnancy isn't a crisis. Sit down, breathe, and stop embarrassing yourself. There's no emergency here." Her tone was a mixture of mockery and menace, designed to intimidate anyone who dared challenge her authority. Sarah's lips trembled as she tried to respond. I'm not overreacting. I'm bleeding, and my contractions—" Another sharp pain cut through her sentence, forcing her to collapse slightly against the desk. The blood was spreading, dark and alarming. "I need a doctor. Please, just a doctor." The room seemed to shrink around her, a suffocating space where fear and injustice collided. Dr. Jennifer Carter, the young resident, finally stepped forward. She approached with cautious determination, her stethoscope swinging around her neck like a badge of conscience. "Sarah, I'm going to help you," she said softly, reaching out her hand. Patricia's eyes snapped toward her, icy and unyielding. "Step back, Carter," Patricia warned, her voice low but threatening. "I make the decisions here. You don't touch this patient without my permission." Dr. Carter paused, calculating the risk. She knew Patricia's reputation, the unspoken rules of the ER hierarchy, the potential consequences for defying the head nurse. But looking at Sarah, her fear, her pain, the very real danger to her unborn child, Dr. Carter felt a moral obligation she could not ignore. She moved closer, just as Patricia leaned over the desk, voice sharp, threatening, and unmistakably in command. Meanwhile, Carlos Mendez, the night shift janitor, quietly observed from the side. He gripped his mop handle, pretending to sweep while subtly pulling out his phone. Patricia's cruelty had long been a shadow over the hospital, but tonight he sensed a line being crossed. With careful movements, he began secretly recording the interaction, documenting the abuse, the intimidation, and the outright neglect. In the corner, a young mother who had been waiting for her own child discreetly lifted her phone, recording Patricia's condescending words and Sarah's visible distress. The air in the waiting room grew heavy. tension vibrating in every corner, every silent gasp and suppressed murmur from the patients who now watched with growing concern. Sarah's trembling hand fumbled for her phone, finally connecting with the one person she trusted above all, her husband, Mayor James Williams. His voice, calm but commanding, filled her ear. "Sarah, what's happening? Are you at the hospital?" Panic rose in his tone as he realized the gravity of the situation. Sarah, gasping between contractions, whispered the events: the abuse, the denial of care, the blood, the pain. "Hold on," he said firmly, his mind racing. "I'm on my way. Don't let anyone stop you from getting help. I'll be there in minutes." The waiting room, once quiet with resigned patients, began to hum with quiet support. Other patients whispered to each other, their empathy bridging the gap between strangers. Some offered water, some words of encouragement, their small acts of solidarity standing in stark contrast to Patricia's relentless cruelty. Sarah's fear was momentarily eased, buoyed by the knowledge that people outside her immediate crisis were aware that someone in authority, her husband, the mayor, was mobilizing to protect her. Despite the visible signs of urgency, Patricia refused to relinquish control. She straightened her uniform, her posture rigid, as if her authority alone could stop the bleeding, the contractions, the impending crisis. "We follow the rules here," she said, her voice low but firm, attempting to maintain a facade of professionalism. "You will stay where you are until I decide what to do." She glanced around the room, believing the witnesses were powerless to challenge her. But the seeds of accountability were already planted. Dr. Carter's determined stance, Carlos's discreet recordings, the young mother's phone, and the whispers of the patients all created cracks in Patricia's armor of invincibility. Outside, Mayor Williams' car lights cut through the darkness, his presence a promise of immediate intervention, though Patricia remained oblivious to the status and influence of the woman she still saw as just another patient. Sarah clutched, her belly, feeling another contraction seize her, the pain sharpening as preterm labor threatened. Her body was responding despite the denial of care, and the tension in the room became palpable, a collective holding of breath. Patricia maintained her rigid control, unaware that her authority was no longer absolute. In the ER's sterile fluorescent light, the confrontation between compassion and cruelty intensified, and the night began to tilt toward justice. By the time the first ambulance sirens echoed in the distance, Sarah's labor had progressed further, her body signaling the urgency that Patricia stubbornly ignored. The head nurse's grip on the narrative remained, but she was increasingly out of step with the reality unfolding in her ER. The night had shifted, and the first true battle for Sarah's safety and dignity was only beginning. The sound of tires squealing on wet asphalt cut through the stillness of the early morning as Mayor James Williams' black SUV pulled into the emergency entrance of Metropolitan General Hospital. The flashing lights of unmarked law enforcement vehicles followed closely behind, their presence commanding attention without a word. Inside, Sarah Williams groaned softly, sweat slick on her brow, her body trembling with contractions that had grown stronger and more urgent by the minute. She barely registered the approaching footsteps, her focus consumed entirely by the pain and fear of what might happen to her baby if help didn't arrive immediately. Patricia Hendress, perched in her usual authoritative position behind the ER desk, sensed something was different. She straightened in her chair, her eyes narrowing, scanning the corridor for the cause of the sudden commotion. The door burst open, and James Williams strode in, his presence radiating authority and urgency. Behind him, hospital board members. Informal suits followed, along with law enforcement officers, their badges gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. Reporters with cameras and microphones were ushered in, capturing the moment, their lenses trained on the unfolding scene. The air, once stagnant with tension, now vibrated with the electricity of confrontation. Patricia's first instinct was to maintain control. "This is a secure area," she said sharply, her tone attempting to command the attention of everyone present. No one enters without clearance. I'm in charge here." She pointed to Sarah with a condescending flick of her hand, trying to reinforce her authority. "She's stable. Everything is under control. There's no—" Her words faltered as James Williams stepped closer, his voice firm and unyielding. "She's my wife," he said, letting the words hang in the air like a weight. "And she is in serious distress. You will not interfere with her care, or there will be consequences." The room went silent, the other ER staff frozen in a mix of shock and disbelief. Patricia's face paled as the magnitude of the situation sank in. Her usual confidence, built on fear and intimidation, faltered under the weight of reality. Sarah, barely able to lift her head, looked up and whispered her husband's name. Relief flickered in her eyes as James knelt beside her, holding her hand, his presence a shield against the cruelty that had plagued her just moments earlier. Dr. Jennifer Carter, sensing the immediate change in power dynamics, stepped forward decisively. She gestured for the staff to clear a path, her voice steady and commanding. "Move her to the delivery room now. I'm taking charge of her care." Security officers moved quickly, documenting the environment, while other witnesses began to recount what they had seen. Carlos Mendiz quietly handing over his phone recordings, the young mother showing her video of Patricia's abusive behavior. The exposure of Patricia's actions spread like wildfire through the room. The slap she had delivered to a visibly pregnant Sarah, the harsh verbal insults, and her deliberate obstruction of urgent medical care were laid bare for everyone to see. Her condescending tone, once feared and unchallenged, was now evidence of cruelty and negligence. Patricia's face turned a shade of crimson, her authority crumbling in front of colleagues, media, and law enforcement alike. The hospital board. Members exchanged knowing glances, their decision-making expedited by the overwhelming proof of misconduct. James Williams stood beside Sarah, his hand steady, his presence commanding, as administrators approached Patricia with the weight of accountability. "You are suspended immediately," one of them stated, her voice formal and final. "This behavior is unacceptable. Effective immediately, you are removed from your duties, pending further investigation." Patricia tried to protest, her voice trembling, but the words fell flat. The authority she had wielded for years evaporated in the face of transparency, the law, and the presence of a mayor who would not tolerate injustice inflicted upon his wife. The other ER staff, previously silent or complicit, began to breathe easier, the oppressive weight of Patricia's intimidation lifting. Dr. Carter guided Sarah onto the stretcher, her hands gentle but firm, ensuring every precaution was taken as monitors were attached and IV lines prepared. Nurses, now under Dr. Carter's clear leadership, worked quickly and efficiently, the urgency of proper medical care replacing the earlier chaos. Sarah's eyes met her husband's, and she whispered a shaky but grateful, "Thank you," as the tension began to ease, replaced by cautious hope. Outside the delivery room, the hospital was a flurry of activity. Security continued documenting the events for official reports, while law enforcement officers conferred quietly with administrators. The media, allowed limited access, captured images of the confrontation, the suspension of Patricia Hendress, and the initial steps toward justice for a woman who had been wronged in the most vulnerable of circumstances. Patricia, seated in a temporary office under watch, replayed the events in disbelief, the humiliation palpable. Her control had been shattered, her cruelty exposed, and her position irreparably damaged. As the delivery team moved Sarah into position, the ER that had just witnessed an escalation of cruelty and abuse now transformed into a space of care, competence, and accountability. The city's eyes were unknowingly on Metropolitan General Hospital, where one pregnant woman's ordeal had triggered immediate intervention, transparency, and the first tangible steps toward justice. Sarah, though exhausted and in pain, felt the reassurance of skilled hands, the protective presence of her husband, and the promise that this night, which had begun in fear and intimidation, was now shifting toward safety, dignity, and hope. The morning after the confrontation at Metropolitan General Hospital, a new atmosphere settled over the city's healthcare system. Investigations began in earnest, led by a coalition of city officials, hospital board members, and independent auditors. The events of the previous night had triggered a deeper scrutiny, revealing layers of systemic discrimination, negligence, and abuse of authority that extended far beyond the ER. Complaints from patients, families, and even staff members poured in, creating a record of misconduct that could no longer be ignored. Patricia Hendris found herself at the center of this storm, facing multiple formal complaints, criminal inquiries, and civil suits that detailed her pattern of abuse. The magnitude of the evidence, from recorded videos to eyewitness testimonies, left little room for evasion. The media coverage was relentless, shining a national spotlight on the issue of healthcare discrimination. Headlines detailed the mistreatment of Sarah Williams, the mayor's wife, but reporters were quick to emphasize that this was not an isolated incident. Stories of biased care, verbal harassment, and denial of medical attention to vulnerable patients sparked outrage and discussion in households, boardrooms, and government offices alike. Advocacy groups, previously struggling to gain traction, now had the leverage to push for meaningful reform. The City Council moved swiftly, drafting legislation aimed at ensuring accountability, transparency, and equity in hospitals and medical facilities across the state. The result was the Sarah Williams Health Care Equity Act, a comprehensive law mandating bias reporting, regular training for all medical staff, independent audits, and clear penalties for violations. Hospitals nationwide began reviewing their own policies, auditing past incidents, and implementing preventive measures to avoid similar failings. It was a cultural shift as much as a legal one, a recognition that systemic change required persistent vigilance and the courage to confront entrenched hierarchies. The act became a model, cited in conferences and journals, illustrating how individual courage could catalyze institutional transformation. Within Metropolitan General Hospital, change was immediate and tangible. Dr. Jennifer Carter, whose intervention had been critical, was promoted to lead the ER team, her professionalism and integrity setting a standard for colleagues. Carlos Mendez, the janitor who had quietly documented Patricia's abuse, was formally recognized for his bravery, receiving commendations from the hospital board and the city. The environment that had once been dominated by fear and intimidation slowly transformed into one of accountability, respect, and collaboration. Patients began to speak out more freely, and staff members were encouraged to report misconduct without fear of retaliation. The ripple effects of this shift extended beyond a single hospital, inspiring similar reforms in healthcare facilities throughout the region. At home, Sarah and James Williams found a sense of restoration. The trauma of the night in the ER gradually eased as their daughter, Maya Williams, was born safely, her first cries echoing through the hospital like a declaration of hope. Their family life, once disrupted by fear and uncertainty, regained stability, strengthened by the knowledge that they had not only survived a personal crisis but had also triggered meaningful change that would benefit countless others. Sarah, recovering from the ordeal, became a symbol of resilience and advocacy, using her platform to raise awareness about patient rights, equitable treatment, and the importance of standing up to injustice. No matter how formidable the opposition, hospitals across the country took notice, implementing bias prevention programs, mandatory sensitivity and cultural competence training, and establishing oversight mechanisms that previously did not exist. The dialogue around healthcare equity shifted from reactive measures to proactive policy, emphasizing prevention over apology, accountability over silence. The narrative of one woman's struggle resonated widely, inspiring medical students, practitioners, and administrators to reconsider the power dynamics inherent in healthcare and to prioritize dignity and respect in every patient interaction. Reflecting on the journey from the dark hours of fear in the ER to the birth of a movement, it became clear that justice, though often slow and challenging, was inevitable when courage met opportunity. Standing up against wrongdoing, even when personal stakes were high, created a chain reaction capable of dismantling entrenched systems of abuse. The ordeal at Metropolitan General Hospital, once a story of intimidation and suffering, had transformed into a testament to the enduring impact of accountability and the capacity of individuals to instigate lasting systemic reform. In the end, Sarah Williams' courage and James Williams' unwavering support had not only safeguarded a life but had sparked a transformation that would resonate for generations, proving that justice, while sometimes delayed, ultimately prevails.